Hi everyone, Candice Malcolm here with True North, coming to you live this Friday afternoon or evening. And I want to talk about the wall. I want to talk about a couple of stories in Canada, specifically a news report that was put out by the Canadian press that touches on an exclusive report that I did about 15 months ago that talks about illegal migrants who are living in the US, who are then able to come to Canada, and Canada facilitates this. Canada has been giving these folks visas and letting these folks stay. So while everyone in the world is talking about the standoff between Trump and the Democrats and whether or not the US is going to finish building the wall and complete the border wall along its southern border, I want to talk a little bit more about why Canada needs to revert to some old policies that we used to have, pretty common sense policies that say that if someone is illegally living in a neighboring country, an allied country, chances are probably not going to follow Canadian immigration rules either, and it's probably not the best idea to be importing these folks. So I'm going to talk about a couple cases today. First, I just wanted to say that Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, is off on another one of these town hall tours of Canada. So he might be coming to a city near you. If so, watch out. It's funny because the mainstream media and a lot of commentators in Canada give Trudeau a lot of credit for doing this. You know, they say like, wow, Trudeau's so open. Look at the way he handles the public. He goes and puts himself out in front of people, Canadians, and takes their questions as if it's some remarkable feat. He does this every year. He did it last year. It's a big PR exercise. And the idea is to contrast Trudeau with the former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, who notoriously would only take a handful of questions from the media and never did these kind of open access things. It's interesting though, because you can say good for you, Trudeau, for putting yourself out there and answering questions. It probably isn't always easy, especially when there's so many constituents of Canadians that are really furious with Trudeau and Liberals for various reasons. But it's not like Trudeau is out there having an honest conversation or an honest discussion with these folks. It's not like he's thinking about the questions that are being asked of him and answering in any kind of thoughtful way. It's literally just Trudeau getting up there, listening to a question, and then repeating Liberal talking points and just stating what his position is on a certain issue without really like comprehending or thinking about what it is that he's saying. So, a couple questions today. I'm going to do a video that goes through a lot of these questions and answers that he's been given. Not today, but it'll probably come out next week. We're working on it right now. But for instance, he was asked about the case of Marissa Shen, who was a 13-year-old girl who was murdered in Burnaby last summer tragically, and the person accused of the murder is a Syrian refugee. So he was asked whether or not his Syrian program was to blame for the tragic death of this young woman, and he just sort of repeated his talking points about how diversity is our strength and whatnot. And he actually said that he thinks it's unhelpful to talk about statistics of refugees and immigrants when considering our multicultural society, which is really unfortunate. He was asked about his comments that he made down in Buenos Aires, Argentina last year, that male construction workers cause a negative social impact on women in rural areas. And again, it was a pretty sincere question. The woman was asked by a young woman who is a worker in the oil and gas sector herself, and she just sort of said, like, can you clarify what you meant by that? And his answer was like nothing to do with a clarification whatsoever. He just said, construction workers are great and they built our community. Next question, basically. And the crowd booed him because that's not an answer to the question. So, if we're going to commend the Prime Minister for being open and putting himself out there and taking questions from Canadians, we should probably at least ask that he addresses the questions that are being asked and doesn't just kind of ramble on with talking points. It doesn't really feel like a conversation. It seems like much more of just a pre-election campaign tour where he's out there bragging about Liberal government accomplishments and repeating, like I said, his pre-scripted answers and talking points, which I just, it's not that interesting and it's not that impressive. So let's get to the topic of the day here. I mentioned off the top that there was a Canadian press story that was picked up by a couple different media outlets this week. Here it is in CTV. The headline here says, "Some undocumented U.S. migrants approved for temporary Canadian visas." And so the story is about a woman who, it starts out by talking about this woman named Alide Sanchez. She crossed into the United States illegally across a section, crossing illegally somewhere. It doesn't say exactly where. Anyway, she lived in the US for 17 years as an undocumented or illegal migrant. She complained in the story about how horrible it was to live in the US because she couldn't get a proper driver's license. Apparently she couldn't buy alcohol because she didn't have ID. And her expectation was naively that she would be able to get status and become a citizen of the US by crossing in illegally. That's obviously untrue. And it is kind of sad that migrants have this misinformation that they believe that by coming into a country illegally that eventually they'll get a normalized status. That's not the case for most countries. And it shows that people are really led and driven by misinformation. So this woman lived in the United States for 17 years. I guess she heard somehow that Canada had a more open approach. So she approached a immigration lawyer in Toronto, and this immigration lawyer worked with her, and they actually successfully managed to get this woman, this Mexican woman, a legal temporary visa for Canada. So she's now studying in Canada. She's doing a master's degree, and she's doing it legally. So she finally has legal status. And the story is a very sympathetic take at this woman and the journey that she's been through. 17 years illegally in the United States, and now a legal resident in Canada. But interestingly, the story kind of focuses in on the immigration lawyer herself, who is a Toronto-based immigration lawyer. And she talks about how, let me just read it because it's really interesting. So it says, let's see, her application. So as an undocumented migrant, so many years illegally in the US, her application for a temporary visa would have likely been denied in the past. So the immigration lawyer is basically saying this would have never happened 3 years ago. It says that right here. She said it would have never happened 3 years ago. In the past, if someone had failed to comply with the regulations of another country, Canada was not willing to take a chance on them, to admit them, and to ask them to follow our rules. But over the last few years, the Canadian government might have quietly revised its approach to some of these applications. Then this immigration lawyer says there's low-level rumors circulating that it's possible to bring these people in for both a study permit and job offers. So there's rumors going around in Canada among immigration lawyers and other practitioners that, hey, Canada has quietly changed its rules and we are now admitting illegal residents from the United States to come into Canada, which it's just sort of a remarkable revelation. That Canada no longer has laws saying, the US is our neighbor and our closest ally. We share a lot of information. We have the largest undefended border in the world. And yet, if you are a person who's in the US illegally, don't tell anyone, but we'll quietly let you in. And the immigration lawyer says she's now worked with a couple of clients that she's brought in this way. Another client was living in the US undocumented, and they were able to get a work permit in Canada. And then basically it just says, it goes on, and she says that basically, let me just find it, that this immigration lawyer wants more undocumented migrants to know that this could be an option for them, but they understand that the government might not want to make any changes public, like they don't want to come out and publicly announce it and promote it because it would upset relations with the United States. That's what this immigration lawyer speculates in this Canadian press piece, which was in CTV, National Post, and a couple of other places. So, this is what the immigration lawyer says again. With the political atmosphere between Canadian and US government, I don't think the federal government in Canada wants to be perceived as rolling out the welcome mat for people who are essentially illegal workers in the US. It might be a bit of a floodgate rationale in that it could start a stampede. No kidding. If I were a illegal migrant in the US and I was worried about getting deported under Trump, why wouldn't you just go to Canada? Obviously, it would start a floodgate, and it would create a serious problem for Canadian-US relations. Like, how can Canadians expect to travel across the border with ease, to come and go, as so many Canadians do and have done for generations, if all of a sudden we have these policies that are kind of like a slap in the face to the Americans and what they're doing to crack down on their own situation? And I think it really does obviously undermine the relationship there. And it also creates a situation where Canada is kind of like becoming a sanctuary country. Like there's sanctuary cities in the US, there's sanctuary states like California. Because of those policies, there's vast numbers of crime, horrible situations with criminal activities of illegal migrants living in those places. Famously, there was a Kate Steinle murder that happened in San Francisco, where she was just randomly shot and killed by an illegal migrant who had been deported from the US 8 times. The guy was so high on drugs that he doesn't even remember killing her. And there was just another case a couple weeks ago, I think a week ago, where a cop was murdered by an illegal migrant. So it happens. And, when you have that sanctuary status, or that idea around you that you'll provide a safe haven for people who are illegal or undocumented, you're going to attract, presumably good people, like the one highlighted in this story, who's, a woman who is just trying to have a normal life and is now doing a master's degree. She obviously wanted to make her status legal. She didn't like living illegally, and so she chose and sought out Canada, even hired an immigration lawyer, because she wanted to have a legal life. I have no doubt that she'll probably be a fine contributing member of Canada, but that's one side of the spectrum. And then the other side of the spectrum is these horrific gang members, MS-13 gang members, and people who, like the individual who murdered the cop in California, and the individual who murdered Kate Steinle in San Francisco. You get both, and that's the problem. And so, when you have a sanctuary status, you just invite all kinds of people. And it isn't necessarily good to promote this kind of lawlessness. Like, if someone hadn't respected the immigration rules and the border laws of our neighboring country, why would we expect them to do the same for us? And it reminds me of another story that I covered in some depth back in 2017, October 2017. So, it's interesting. There's a lot of talk and back and forth about building the wall, a lot of criticism from the mainstream media in the US against Trump and the Republicans for wanting to build a wall. And one of the things that we keep hearing is that, there's no examples of terrorists who are coming across the border illegally, who are illegally crossing the US-Mexico border. That's simply not true. I read an entire CNN article about it. The headline was like, most of the terrorists in the US that have come from Canada, not Mexico, or something along those lines. That's false. There's well-documented, it's not a lot of people, but there have been cases, probably a dozen or so in the last few years, of known terrorists coming across that southern border. And one of the examples is an individual who actually made his way to Canada and is alleged to have committed a ISIS-inspired terrorist attack in Edmonton. So folks remember, it was last October, or maybe it was 2 Octobers ago now. I guess it was October 2017. A individual who had come from the United States. He was a Somali guy, and his name was Abdullah Hassan Sharif. He entered the U.S. illegally from Tijuana, so he crossed illegally into the U.S. He was detained by American immigration officials, and because he didn't have a passport, because he couldn't really explain why he was in Mexico in the first place, he was detained and set to be deported. He ended up skipping bail. He didn't show up to his next court appearance. He was gone, and he showed up at the Canada-US border. He, again, crossed another border illegally, came to Canada, and it was in Canada where he claimed asylum. And he just said, I'm a refugee from Somalia, let me stay. The Canadian government did let him stay. He was eventually granted refugee status. And then in October 2017, he's alleged to have, this was a case where he drove a rental van through a crowd of people. He ran over 5 people, including a cop. He then got out of the car and started stabbing the cop before fleeing, and he was eventually arrested and detained, and he's now on trial for that terror attack. Allegedly, he also had an ISIS flag in his car during the attack. And so this is an obvious example of an alleged terrorist who came, he crossed 2 borders illegally. He illegally came from Mexico into the United States, and then he illegally crossed the border from the United States into Canada while he was evading a deportation order from the United States. So if you followed all that, it's pretty convoluted. But I was looking into this back in 2017, and I wrote about it. I wrote several reports about it for the Toronto Sun. And one of the things I didn't understand was why he was granted refugee status in the first place. If he was an illegal immigrant in the United States who had a deportation order, a pending deportation order, why did Canada admit him? Why didn't we just deport him the second he was detained? Say, oh, this is the same guy who the U.S. has an outstanding deportation order on. No, you can't come to Canada this way. Send it back to Somalia. Send it back to Somalia. Well, instead, Canada did let him stay. So I was digging into it. I spoke to an official with Public Safety, the Department of Public Safety, which is Canada's version of Homeland Security. And I got a quote from that former official who basically told me, this is from my original report, that biometric screening, which uses eye scans, fingerprints, and a live photo, is designed to stop foreign criminals from moving within the Five Eyes security network. So the Five Eyes security network is the intelligence and security partnership between Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And so it's designed, even if an individual like this Somali fellow who used a different name and didn't have a passport when he came to Canada, we should have still been able to identify him. And so I reported on that. And then it was really interesting because Trudeau's parliamentary secretary to public safety, a guy named Mark Holland, responded to my report in the Sun by writing an article. He wrote a letter of the editor to the Toronto Sun, which they published. And he basically said, this, Sharif indeed CBS, which is a Canadian Border Services Agency, through both biometrics and biographical information. And then he said, but your admissibility to another country does not affect your ability to enter Canada or make an asylum claim. So just to repeat that, because it's so astonishing. Your admissibility to another country, like the United States, does not affect your ability to enter Canada or make an asylum claim. So in other words, you could be a person who's not admissible to the United States. The United States could have a pending deportation order against you, like this case, and that doesn't affect your ability to come to Canada, which is just bizarre. What's the point of having a shared information system? What's the point of having an ally and a neighbor that you sort of trust and work together when it comes to national security if someone who is barred from the United States is just welcome to come to Canada? That's mind-boggling. That's a change in policy. That's something that was never really announced. They never came out and said it, but that's not the long-standing policy that Canada has had. And so the idea that this guy was basically just, sure, he was illegal in the United States. Sure, he evaded a deportation order and skipped out on bail, essentially. That doesn't matter. Canada just let him in, and obviously that was a very terrible idea because he's now charged and sitting on trial for terrorism. Unfortunately, he didn't kill anyone in Edmonton, but he ran people over and he stabbed a police officer, allegedly with an ISIS flag in his vehicle. So this is what happens when you don't have a secure border, when you don't have coherent laws. And the fact that this is happening, it is kind of one thing to say, the guy came illegally, once he's in Canada, we couldn't really deport him because we can't send him back to Syria because it's a war zone, or something, sorry, Somalia, because it's a war zone. And then you're kind of stuck with the guy, but he should at least be detained. He shouldn't be out in the open allowed to commit a terror attack in Edmonton. But now we're proactively going out and giving people visas. So, it doesn't matter that you lived illegally in the United States. It doesn't matter that you broke that country's laws and disrespected that country by entering illegally and then staying and not trying to right it by, leaving and then trying to come back legally or trying to get a visa to live legally in the United States. Instead, you're just kind of skipping to the next country. It's not like the Mexican woman who's now studying her master's degree in Canada. It's not like she really wanted to come to Canada. Canada was just the only country that would let her do this, that would give her a visa despite her illegal status in the United States. So I just don't really understand how this is defensible, why the Trudeau government has made these changes, and they've kind of done it in a sneaky, backhanded way. Like, we're just kind of like quietly now accepting illegal migrants from the US in the midst of this sort of politicized storm in the US of, building a wall and deporting illegal criminals, and all these sort of left-wing cities and states declaring themselves sanctuary. Well, Canada's jumping in on that. And I think it really undermines the partnership that Canada and the Americans are supposed to have when it comes to protecting our borders, protecting sort of North American security, perimeter security it's sometimes called, and working together to combat jihadist terrorism as well. That is a connected angle. And anytime you see a report on CNN or any other liberal news site that says there's no examples of terrorists coming across the Mexico-US border, I just gave you one. It's a pretty well documented, phenomenon that happens, that occasionally, who knows what a Somalian migrant was doing in Mexico in the first place, other than, someone probably told him it's the easiest way to get into the United States is just to fly down to Mexico, that if you tried to fly directly into the US, they wouldn't let you, they wouldn't give you a visa and you'd get stopped. But if you go down to Mexico, there are ways to get across, and that's the whole idea behind the wall. And again, obviously, I'm not arguing that Canada and the U.S. should build a wall along Canada-U.S. border. When I say build a wall, I meant in terms of, we used to have policies that prevented illegal people who are in the U.S. illegally from coming into Canada, and we've gotten rid of that policy. So the wall would be like a metaphor. But, it's kind of sad that as the U.S. is taking these steps to focus on national security and border security, Canada is not only heading in the opposite direction, but we're also kind of undermining the U.S. attempts by saying, we'll take these people, we'll let them live in Canada, and then, it actually hurts Canadians who want to be able to travel freely to the United States. Sooner or later, if we keep doing this, our American allies are just going to say, okay, the Canadian-U.S. border is not going to be as open and as easy to cross as it currently is, because we just don't trust the Canadians. They're actively importing people who we don't want in our country to go into their country. And then once you get a Canadian passport or a Canadian permanent residency card, it becomes a lot easier to go back and forth into the U.S. So people can circumvent American border and immigration laws through Canada. And we really shouldn't be part of that, enabling that kind of phenomenon. It's pretty pathetic. Let me know what you think. If you have any examples, of anyone out there watching or listening has examples or knows of this happening, let me know, because we have a couple of ongoing investigations into looking into, the number of people who come into Canada from the United States, how many of them have criminal records. We've got, a couple of different stories that we're working on the sort of investigative journalism front. So if anyone has any tips or knows of this kind of stuff happening, don't hesitate to send me a message. And on that note, with the True North Initiative and True North, we have a lot of exciting changes. We've brought on some new people. We have some new reports coming out. If you go on our website, truenorthinitiative.com, we have new reports out every day. We've been putting out a lot of content and doing exclusives and stuff that the mainstream media is just sort of constantly failing to do, writing about stories that I think are pretty important. And if you want more on this topic that I was talking about today, with the phenomenon of illegal migrants from the US being able to come to Canada, I have a column in the Toronto Sun that should be out now or will be out later this evening, so keep an eye out for that. As always, thanks so much for watching. I hope everyone has a great weekend. And don't forget to check out the True North Initiative. Don't forget to go check out that website. If you're interested and you want to support the work that we do, we really appreciate it. We have 2 different clubs that you can join that give you levels of support. So you support our independent journalism, and in exchange, you get early access to our products. You get special products emailed to you. You get True North swag, which is awesome. And we're going to start doing quarterly live Q&As with myself and other True North journalists. So if you're interested and you want to support us, check that out under True North Clubs. So I will leave it at that. Have a great weekend, everyone.